Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, Audible.
Awesome. Four things in this speech. First, some setup on what this narrative looks like and what the comparative is, and then three arguments. First, it's a massive waste of time and has a massive opportunity cost. Second, this makes people worse at committing to long-term relationships that they will eventually want and makes them worse at doing those in either world. And thirdly, it increases the likelihood in which people are sexually assaulted, which wins the debate on its own. Let's talk about setup. How does this look like? What does this narrative look like? What does the rise look like, I suppose? It looks like, I suppose, these things. First, the rise of hookup dating apps, things like Grindr, things like Tinder being used primarily to pursue sex. Second, it looks like cultural norms that mean that you spend the entirety of your 20s pursuing relatively casual relationships with fewer expectations. You delay the pursuit of long-term relationships till later in your life, things that are still culturally valorized, but later in life. And thirdly, it looks like the decline of third spaces by which people make entirely unplanned casual sex. What's the counterfactual? It's probably people pursuing long-term relationships earlier. It's probably still a more strong glorification of them and people practicing them earlier on in their life and more prominently. But also, it looks like probably we still are able to have unplanned happenstance, holiday romances, fucking someone in a bar. Like that is not something that like entirely ceases to exist, and it's probably not really part of the rise. It's probably, I think the rise meaningfully speaks about people pursuing romance and relationships primarily through the lens of entering into casual arrangements rather than sometimes entering into casual arrangements, but their primary orientation is towards long-term ones. Let's talk about our three arguments. And first, this is a massive waste of time. Four reasons here. First, just to preempt the idea that it is good to learn skills of practicing romance and practicing sex, we would say that the kinds of skills you obtain from casual romance are actually counterproductive because it teaches you that conflicts you can obtain that you enter into and the natural part of romance and entering into relationships with people can be easily escaped because relationships are low stakes, and so you don't really obtain very good skills, and it actually is quite counterproductive to future skills that are quite useful to people. Secondly, it means that you have less information on your partners because the avenues between which you are pursuing them are often very unreliable. You're looking at photos, you're looking at bios that people have created on dating apps as a way of defining whether or not someone's a good person, instead of, for instance, more likely pursuing someone in your real life you've met through your job or through your hobbies, and expect to form a long-term bond with. And that means that you have less information about those people, which means those relationships end up being less good and less enriching. But thirdly, it warps your expectations of what real relationships looks like because real relationships involve serious conversations, things like entangling your assets, and it involve serious commitment to things that happen in 10 to 15 years, which are often pretty scary to people. And those conversations involve quite a lot of psychological practice. But when you enter into casual relationships, you build the expectation that you can just exit things when it becomes hard. You feel as if the things that you did earlier in your life, when you had more unattached and fun and undefined relationships that were casual, are actually, you form the bias that those things are preferable rather than practicing those skills that are actually relevant to those relationships, which is deleterious for people. But fourthly, there's super likely to be asymmetries of expectations when people enter into these relationships. So see Chappelle Roan Casual, which is just when two people enter into a casual arrangement, they often fall in love because sex like makes kind of people fall in love, and spending any amount of time with someone can kind of put love on the table. But that's often asymmetric because you don't enter into it with that expectation, which involves far, far more people who end up, and especially in the world where this rises, right? And you're involving more people who aren't particularly psychologically disposed to this way of navigating romance, who end up enormously hurt by this. The opportunity cost of this is enormous because you don't spend time practicing the skills that are relevant to self-discovery in long-term relationships and practicing the kinds of difficult commitments that make those relationships productive, which makes them on net less fulfilling. I'll take a POI now.
Do you like to come?
I love to come, Matthew. Thank you for asking me that. Some people don't, though. Let's talk about being worse at commitment to good relationships. The framing here is people want like long-term relationships in either world, right? Because these things, even in the world in which casual romance has arisen, are still culturally valorized. Most people still view, even if they're entering into casual relationships and spending most of their 20s on that they want to eventually get married or eventually settle down and have a long-term relationship. And there's often financial benefits to this and the sense that you'll be emotionally valorized deeply by those kinds of things. But the rise of this has made people think that they can pursue those things later in life. The problem with this is that The things that we've just described you trading off by pursuing casual romance makes that much harder. And that's bad because committing to a long-term relationship and actually getting the benefits out of one is really difficult. First, because it requires you to practice emotional vulnerability, which is difficult for people to do. Secondly, because it requires real labor, money, physical effort, time. It requires you to weigh off long-term prospects with short-term ones, which is a skill and psychological practice that involves lots of effort and often making mistakes early on in your life. And it's difficult to practice because you have relatively few chances at it. This makes it harder because people become even more risk averse because there's more likelihood that when you try to pursue a long-term relationship, you're hurt by someone else having the expectations that it's casual, so you don't practice it as much, and it's less glorified, so people don't take the time to learn the skills that are actually relevant to making the relationships that they will eventually want, things that actually bring them the benefits. And that means that we're worse at those relationships. The impact is, in either world, people want to pursue long-term relationships, but those relationships are just less good. They have more conflict, which they have more difficulty resolving because both parties are less willing to engage. They form worse partners because they have less practice at selecting for good partners. They happen later in life, which often means people regret that because they fear the lost time of the time with their real beloved partner and the children that they're not going to spend time with. People have kids later in their life, which is a real harm, right? Like, it means that people do childbirth in their late 30s and early 40s, which massively exponentially increases the risks of things like stillbirth, which traumatizes people, things like death and disability, all of which I think are regrettable phenomena that have been caused by people delaying serious relationship formation to later in their life. But also, it makes people more likely to cheat in long-term relationships because they regress to the patterns that they had in casual relationships where they thought those things were easy and they escape them when they get hard. All of which is bad because it traumatizes people, it makes people have worse relationships, and it's bad because people don't access the true benefits of long-term relationships, which are enormous, which are feeling supported, feeling a rich emotional connection, and as if you were truly heard by someone. Briefly then, this increases the likelihood of sexual assault. 5 reasons. Firstly, because you have sex with aggregately more people, some of those people are likely to be rapists. Secondly, people with whom you can source, these are people you can source less information about because they're less likely to be sourced from your real life, and people that you expect to see again, all of which means you can source less information about them, e.g. if they are rapey. Thirdly, you accept less more unfamiliar scenarios in which you have sex, and you therefore find it harder to assert your sexual boundaries because you are less comfortable. Fourthly, because the rules are more undefined, because it's casual, it's easier to have your consent violated. And finally, contexts where people have casual sex are generally far more anonymous, which emboldens people who are predatory to not have accountability. The harms of rape, I think, are relatively obvious, and I think carry us comfortably, even if nothing else does. Proud to affirm.
And then PM, inverting yellow whenever you're ready.
If somebody had told 18-year-old Jackie that the person I'd chosen to date at that stage of my life was somebody I was expected to be in a relationship with for the next 7 years, I would have run away screaming. Because this is a team that acknowledges the challenges of relationships, identifies they rely on us making mistakes when we're young to learn, but denies individuals the ability to enter those short-term relationships that have lesser stakes, that bring comfort to the people within them, and grant them the agency to make those mistakes, to discover more about themselves. Clearly, these are relationships which are good then. 3 issues in this speech. The first thing I want to explain is just why these relationships are good in the absolute. And the first premise I want to prove is that it is actually the only set of relationships which are accessible for quite a few people. I think there are 3 categories of individuals who are constrained in this way. Firstly, people who are logistically constrained, holidays, exchange students, etc., who do not have the capacity to enter long-term relationships. Secondly, people who just don't feel ready for something long-term, many of whom are likely to be people who have had previously bad past relationships, or alternatively are very new to the world of romance and therefore are very uncomfortable with entering long-term relationships. Thirdly, you just might not be able to commit because of your lifestyle. And that looks like individuals such as fly-in, fly-out mining workers, for instance, night shifters, etc. Those are all people who can typically only access those short-term casual relationships. That's just for the reason that the length of a relationship is typically correlated in the minds of the participants with its severity and commitment. So in long-term relationships, there's often an expectation of an intense amount of commitment, which does not exist for our side of of the house, which means those individuals are able to enter those relationships. Why are those relationships good then? 3 reasons. Firstly, you get some sex, which is, as per Oscar's response to RPOI, pretty good. Secondly, under our side of the house, you can alleviate loneliness. You have a friend who you know is always there, always willing to listen to you. And thirdly, you can just do a bunch of fun activities, go hang out with this individual in a way which is particularly close. That means that individuals are able to access those benefits under our side for 3 reasons. Firstly, in the absence of this norm, there are less individuals seeking this type of relationship, which makes it much harder for individuals who want this type of romance to enter into it. Secondly, even if this isn't true, if you have one partner enter 3 relationships into a long-term relationship time span, then you access 3 times this many people in that relationship process. This is a Keynesian multiplier of love. And that is something we uniquely get to defend under our side of the house. Thirdly, as Oscar identifies, dating apps have made this more accessible under the status quo. And fourthly, just by the fiat of this motion, we are obviously able to take advantage of the rise in the presence of these relationships, which means that we get those benefits under our side of the house. Even if there is a trade-off to long-term relationships, as this team suggests, why do we think our side is still better? Firstly, you get to experience more relationships. Those relationships teach us things, help us enrich our lives. And importantly, contrary to what this team says, it's actually experiences with different people who teach us the most about ourselves and what we ourselves only want. Because that's the point at which you expose yourself to a diversity of different types of relationships and understand which one you love the most. Under their model, when you're locked into one particular person, you only ever get to understand that one type of love. Which means that in 10 years, if you find that you've regretted the way your life has gone, you'll never know if there were alternate pathways that could have brought you more happiness. Secondly, we think there's far less pressure in the relationship under our side. People just have more fun when there's a mutual understanding that this is a relationship which is casual. Thirdly, we think there are a set of individuals who select into these relationships who are in particularly young lifestyle stages, in a place where this sort of style of relationship is the most suitable. See their own analysis about why older people trend towards long-term relationships anyways, which means that the alternative in this debate is that young people, like high school sweethearts, for instance, automatically lock into long-term relationships without ever getting to see and meaningfully develop as people outside of the context of that relationship. And fourthly, short-term relationships and casual relationships do not constrain other parts of your life. They open up access for individuals to do things like travel, to work overseas, to experience foreign education, none of which is nearly as easy when you feel a close, tied-down commitment and causing a lot of regret and angst in future relationships. The final observation we'll make is that the entering process of a relationship in and of itself is just really fun and brings a lot of joy to people. People like getting to meet someone new, to put on a nice dress and go out for a nice dinner. All of that is something that we uniquely access. We allow individuals to experience that spark at far greater degree. I'll take a point.
Yeah, you're required to support a normalization. This clearly requires a broader shift in social relationships and norms outside of just like fly in, fly out relationships.
Yeah, the point here, as we explained, is that when it's normalized, that enables those individuals to access those relationships at all. Because in the absence of a normalization of those relationships, that set of individuals cannot find appropriate partners who want to pursue those sorts of relationships. Let's look at the second clash in this debate, which is just to explain why once you do decide to enter a long-term relationship, having that experience in a normalized casual relationship world is still much better for those relationships. Firstly, as we've already explained, you can learn much more about yourself in those different relationships. You can learn what you like. You can learn what types of sex you enjoy. You can learn how to communicate better and what sort of communication styles work for you. You can learn what activities you really want to pursue with your partner to get to know them the best. More importantly, you learn how to support your partner. You come to understand that they might have a variety of different needs, which is something that you now are able to take your experience and apply to them in a way which is particularly helpful. Secondly, we think there exists a set of relationships which would be good in the long term under the status quo, but their long-term potential is not evident at the point at which you enter into those relationships. Under our side of the house, you are more likely to enter into relationships in the first instance because you understand they are less of a commitment, which means that there's a far greater likelihood you actually do start dating, you enter into relationships which could prospectively become long-term relationships at the point at which you find a lot of joy and love in those. Thirdly, I think you just have a lot less pressure in those early stages. So if the norm, and fourthly, I think insofar as you just are able to see more people, you do feel like you can make a better decision because you have more information. But additionally, the perception internally that you played the field, so to speak, you've seen what everyone is out there to offer, means that you're much more likely to be content with the final decision you make, rather than thinking about what could have been and that sort of thing. The final observation I want to make in this debate is that under our side of the house, it's far easier to leave those relationships, and that's for 4 reasons. Firstly, there's a far lower commitment. Secondly, if there's an active norm of individuals having multiple casual relationships over the course of their youth, people understand that the current partner you're with is not likely to be your soulmate and feel less of a severe commitment. But additionally, that also makes it so that external parties are less likely to apply social stigma for going against the norm for individuals who choose to leave those relationships. Finally, it's just materially less awkward when both parties understand that relationships can be casual and do not necessarily have to be permanent. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, we get a lot more people just leaving relationships at the point at which they are unhappy. They probably are likely, unlike what Oscar says, to try to fix it, but insofar as that is unsuccessful, we do not pressure them to stay forever. Secondly, we think you have less bad behavior at the point of exit. And thirdly, you get much less social ostracism for a set of individuals who are particularly vulnerable insofar as they have just left such an unsuccessful relationship.
Thanks, Ella. Inviting TPM whenever you're ready.
Okay, hello. Another time.
Yeah.
I'll have fun, Oscar. Okay. This team's conception of casual relationships is really, really strange. They seem to believe that a casual relationship is a deeply intimate and emotional connection with someone else where you get to know them really well that just happens to last a short period of time. But that is definitionally what they are. The problem with casual relationships is either they are actually casual, in which case they are not useful, and in fact reinforce a series of negative and harmful practices and approaches towards relationships, and you don't get the rich meeting of diverse ranges of people that they claim, or they are intimate enough to be productive, in which case people have a shit and unfulfilling time whilst inside them, get hurt once they leave them, and are traumatized and turned off relationships on the whole. This team tries to claim that casual relationships can be both of those things without realizing that they can't be and without realizing that both of those things are bad. 2 questions in the speech: are casual relationships good, and do casual relationships have a positive or negative effect on relationships in general? Let's talk about whether casual relationships in and of themselves are good. And I want to note here that before the rise of casual relationships, people were in relationships a pretty similar amount of the time. So it is actually a pretty important question if they are more enjoyable and emotionally enriching than a long-term relationship. What does this team say? The first thing they say is that these are the only relationships that some people can enter. 2 responses. Number 1, a lot of their arguments here are pretty niche, and I just don't really care about them. I don't really care about FIFO workers' capacity to get a root. I care much more about the average person's capacity to have rich and fulfilling relationships. These people, obviously, by the way, can still have like long-term relationships that are just periodically long distance, etc. The second problem with this, though, is that many of their arguments are circular. For example, the groups of people that they say need casual relationships are people who want casual relationships, but obviously those people, firstly, want casual relationships because the rise of casual relationships has occurred. It's a socially ingrained expectation that they have, a thing that they think is more reasonable or should be more common, or that they should be more likely to pursue because other people are also doing them. But secondly, this debate, at least to an extent, is about a shift in what people want, and therefore claiming these group of people as a benefit is a circular way to engage in the debate. They make another series of claims then. They say you get more sex. I'll flip this claim. Yes, people like to come, Matt, but people come a lot more when they're in long-term relationships with the same person that they have a serious commitment to than someone who they see only periodically and only have a casual relationship. But secondly, they have substantially better sex because they get to know the person's sexual preferences better, have a more emotionally intimate sexual engagement with them, and therefore enjoy that sex more. Casual relationships often negatively polarize people against sex because they feel robbed of their personhood after having sex with another person because they feel used for their body rather than cared about as a human being, which means sex gets better on our side. Next, they say casual relationships are fun and you go on dates. I won't repeat the rebuttal because it's identical here. People go on dates in long-term relationships, and they go on better dates in long-term relationships because they get to know what's fun and what they like doing with their partner and what their common interests are. Next, they say, well, on their side, you experience more different people, and therefore being in lots of casual relationships is better than being in one long-term relationship. Two responses to this. Number one, on their side, you meet more people, but you, as we explained, don't actually get to know them. So maybe you meet 3 people, but you get the benefit of having met none because you never actually engaged in the level of emotional intimacy and trust that's required to let your guard down, and therefore they don't let their guard down either, and you never get to know who they truly are. So it's never as enriching as being in a long-term relationship. And I'd also like to notice the false dichotomy that they propose, because it's untrue that on our side you get in 1 relationship and on their side you get in 3. People obviously enter in a number of long-term relationships throughout their life. The second response to this, though, is to point out that even if you do get to know them, you don't reach the crucial barrier of actually loving them, because at that point it ceases to be a casual relationship and probably persists into the long term. And obviously the key distinction between casual relationships and long-term serious relationships is that component of loving them. And what I asked this team then is, why are they pursuing casual relationships and not just friends? Because the difference between a relationship and a friendship is that barrier of love. So on their side, you could get all of these benefits just from having lots of friends from overseas and from different backgrounds. On our side, you get the benefit that is actually unique to relationships, which is learning how to love another person and being loved by another person. And you only get that when you let down the barriers of trust and are with someone for a long enough time to actually learn to love them properly. Why do we say that casual relationships are bad? 2 reasons that don't get any engagement, and a couple others that I'm probably forgetting from Oscar's speech. Firstly, you are extremely likely to fall in love with that person and get hurt when they leave once they realize that you're in love with them. That is because having sex with someone sets off biological triggers in your brain and pheromones that make you fall in love with this person. And at the point where they realize you're in love with them and they only want a casual relationship, they leave you, which makes you feel used and abused and means you cling on to it for longer than you should. But secondly, even if you don't fall in love, a lot of people end up feeling shallow and used because they never get the level of emotional intimacy that normally comes with sex and that normally comes with relationships. And as a result, feel like they are not really a person whilst they're inside of them. Even you might be asking then, why do people enter into casual relationships if they're so bad? 3 reasons. Number 1, the social expectation to do so. Secondly, because they don't have any other way to have sex. And thirdly, because people are overly ambitious. A, about their capacity to avoid catching feelings, and B, about the likelihood the person they've caught feelings for will catch feelings for them too eventually. I'll take a POI if there's one.
Yeah, so obviously FIFO workers as the example is niche, but there's like 10,000 different examples, all as niche as FIFO workers. And by summing them up, we get a large set of people who
Firstly, I explained that those people can enter into long-term relationships that are periodically long distance. And secondly, I don't actually think there are 10,000 examples of FIFO workers. The vast majority of people live and stay in one place for a long period of time and do have the capacity to enter a long-term relationship. Second question I want to ask then is, do casual relationships have a positive or negative effect on relationships in general? The claim they make here is people are more likely to start dating and enter relationships in the first instance if they are casual. 2 responses. Number 1, people obviously enter into relationships on both sides. Prior to the rise of casual relationships, people weren't automatically incels. The vast majority of people entered into long-term relationships. That's because there's strong pressure to do so. Firstly, because people know they're enjoyable. Secondly, because they're culturally praised and glorified. And thirdly, because there's social pressure from the people around them to do so. But the second issue with this is the relationships people enter on our side are far more likely to be successful into the long term than theirs. Because if their claim is you should enter into a casual relationship under the expectation that it will eventually become a long-term relationship, that is a recipe for a disaster, because the other person isn't expecting the same thing as you, or at least isn't guaranteed to expect the same thing as you, which means you're far more likely to get hurt. And I would observe that that capacity to get hurt is an additional deterrent to never enter into relationships. The next claim they make is the stakes are lower at the beginning of the relationship. That's benefit, but this is obviously not really comparative to what real long-term relationships look like. Obviously, pressure and stakes scale over time. It's just on their side, the stakes are capped at a very low level. On our side, the longer you're with that person, the longer those stakes get, and the more significant that relationship becomes. What is our claim? We say people are far less likely to understand how to commit and to commit to other people on side opposition, because it's an easy opt-out from doing so. They get less practice at it. It becomes less glorified, and the risk of entering into a committed relationship becomes larger. Clearly, this is a government win.
Ada yang DPM, inviting dialogue whenever you're ready.
This team's conception of a casual relationship is baffling to me, right? Because like if you think for the situationship, often it means you're sleeping with a friend, often you're unsure of whether you're going to be into a relationship or whether you're not. Often you'll know their hobbies, you'll know what's been going on in the day, you'll also know when they're upset if they did badly on an exam. Like there's a conversations people have even in the course of just a regular casual relationship, because people don't just have sex and leave immediately afterwards. You have a conversation in between because you're like a normal regular person. Like it obviously isn't a scale where casual romances, you only have sex and that's it, versus, well, if you talk about your feelings a little bit, now you're going to a relationship, just their side. Insane dichotomy this team sets out, and one which probably loses them debate because it means they cannot engage with any of our material charitably. First thing I'm going to deal with is wipe out this argument on sexual assaults. Their mechanisms basically boil down to you have sex with more people, and also situations are a bit unclear. Few responses. Number one, under their side, intimate partner violence is actually far more common in long-term relationships for two reasons. Firstly, it's because lines are far more blurrier because there are assumed ways of communication and how people consent to things, which means it's far harder to know when barriers are bridged, and that makes people uncomfortable and makes people in situations where they don't want to be in. But also technically, I think people often also struggle to say no to partners they've been with for a long time. They often feel more pressure. They often feel like they have to say yes, or otherwise they're being a bad partner. And these sorts of instances are also quite awful in precipitating instances where it results in more violence. But secondly, they kind of factual Oscar stands for is that, well, you just go to a bar, right? Like instead of entering a long-term relationship or a casual relationship, you go to the bar, you have a one-night stand. Obviously still has all the harms of sexual assault on their side. But thirdly, I think that at the point where casual romances are normalized, and if this is a problem, more discussions exist when it comes to questions about consent, how to say no, what you should be looking out for, things you can do to ensure that you're comfortable, and what people should actually facilitate to make you feel comfortable, means that it's going to be far less likely to happen as well. This argument will not win the debate. It is at best like totally symmetric on both sides, or at least worse for them. Second question that I'm going to ask then is, what makes for better relationships? Because let's just say the entire case is actually framed around a premise that the ideal in any world is that you build towards a long-term relationship and you end up in a long-term relationship. But it's deeply unclear to me why a long-term relationship is actually the end goal which we ought to achieve in this debate. Because the vast majority of the world is moving to a world where people aren't entering into long-term relationships, people aren't getting married anymore for two reasons. Because firstly, many people are choosing to remain single or uncuffed because there is more freedom, because they want to focus on other ambitions or other aspects of life. But secondly, even from an ideological perspective, many view marriage as a patriarchal concept. And to be honest, I think it's a bit stupid, but many people do genuinely see it in that way as well, which is why people would opt into non-normative relationships, whether it is casual, whether it is like polyamorous or whatever. This is something which is people are increasingly doing, which therefore means all the skills as to you merging your assets, how to have these difficult conversations. Do you want children? Do you not want to have children? How are we going to buy a house? Actually totally immaterial to these sorts of people, which therefore means it's deeply unclear to me to why this is the objective we ought to achieve in the first place. But let's get into the weeds a little bit more as well and talk about what they want to say. Oscar says that, firstly, this is worse because people don't care about your sexual pleasure because they're able to leave. Few things. One, this only applies to like one-night stands. In a situationship where people are going to sleep with each other on multiple instances, you still are probably going to care about each other's pleasure. But secondly, you have an incentive to care about each other's pleasure because you get a better experience, they get a better experience. It's going to be a more mutually beneficial and enjoyable relationship for both of you. But thirdly, even if this is true, it is the person who exclusively cares about their own pleasure and jumps between one-night stand to one-night stand, they're unable to access sex as easily and as commonly because they don't have an existing relationship with that person, because they're someone who is bad at sex and doesn't care about other people. It means they're also incentivized to eventually learn how to care about other people and to care about another person's pleasure, which is going to be mutually beneficial for their own growth, but also whoever they choose to sleep with in the future as well. This mechanism does not make sense. Secondly, they say that, well, there's less information, which is therefore bad. There's less information, and in their world, you're far more likely to be with who have shared jobs or shared hobbies. One, don't shit where you eat. But secondly, I think there's a plethora of information available on things like social media to get a gauge of a person. Maybe it's an imperfect proxy, but for example, if you see someone who exclusively posts shirtless beach pics, you can probably know a red flag, don't want to get with them. And that is a relatively good signal at which people can assess on themselves as to whether they want to sleep with them. But thirdly, I think you just obviously interact with them beyond having sex, right? Like you do have a conversation, you talk about what you've watched the other day, you talk about your own hobbies. Like it doesn't need to be a deep emotional connection for me to talk about Game of Thrones with someone. Like that seems like it's going to exist there. The next claim, which Oscar then says, is that it warps your expectations and now you're afraid to do serious talk. One, you obviously don't need to have these conversations at age 18. Secondly, people can choose when to transition, right? Because people do on a whole know what they want. They know that they want to have fun in the early 20s, and they know that after 25 they want to start into a relationship, which therefore means at that point they're willing to transition and they're willing to learn. And to be honest, learning more about how to handle a mortgage at age 25 is going to be better than any sort of advice you're taking at age 18, which is why I think even if you're learning about the more serious stuff at a later age, you're able to adapt into it better because you're more mature, you're probably more intelligent, you know more about the world and how it operates. The last thing that they say is that there's going to be asymmetric expectations, which is they say, and that's going to be bad because someone loves the other person more. But firstly, that is true even for a relationship as well, right? But it's far harder for people to facilitate those kind of asymmetric expectations when you're in a long-term relationship, and it's far harder to break it off. In these casual relationships, at the point when someone feels asymmetric feelings, the norm is just that, I'm sorry, we have to break it up. And yes, it's going to suck in the short term and in the interim, but it's going to be significantly better than under the comparative when you're in a long-term relationship and you realize you love someone more and the other person did not love you as much, which is why it's comparatively better. Then let's hear about what Charlie brings up. Charlie says a few things, which is well, people actually come more under their side, and that is a good thing. Firstly, Matt doesn't. But secondly, I think it's also untrue as well, right? Just that, like, often it's incredibly unexciting to have sex with actually, POY, anyone?
No, sorry.
Okay, two, maybe often when you're in a long-term relationship, often the sex is deeply unexciting, right? Which is to say, you repeat and you rehash, you don't learn, you kind of just do it, you have, sex twice a week, and it's relatively boring, which is why, A, people have affairs and shit, but also B, why when people leave a long-term relationship, they go to the first person they have sex with, like, it's the most amazing sex they've had in their life. Unclear why more sex equals better sex. Outside, out of order. Outside, our claim here is that you have sex with more people, there's more variety, so you can learn what you like, and that is something which is the enriching experience and one which is beneficial to most people, which is why more sex isn't necessarily even good. We get more sex, but also we get more variety and more interesting sex, which makes people far more enriched. The second thing they say here is that you're likely to enter into what do we have here? Oh, then Charlie makes a claim that, well, on the outside, if you want companionship, you can just have friends. The only difference is you choose to love someone. No, the difference between between a friend and a relationship is you have sex in between, which is what a casual romance does, and a friendship cannot possibly substitute. The next thing that they claim here is they go, well, you enter in with an expectation. Well, the reason why people access casual romance is often because they have no alternatives. That is a concession of our claim, that this is a form of relationship they would otherwise not be able to access in either extremes of the world, whether it is like you can't get a relationship or whether it is because you can't get into a long-term relationship. So presumably that concession means we capture a group of people that is a necessary benefit in this debate. At the end of this debate, the thing you had to understand is we get people way more sex. You did not need to learn about all the boring ass life skills this government team wants to talk about. We let people have fun. We let people grow into their own. That is something which makes people happy, and that's why we win the debate.
Thank you, Yellow. Inviting Kafeb whenever you're ready.
Hello. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The observation I want to begin with is to observe that the counterfactual is not instantly marrying your high school sweetheart. It is typically dating a couple of people throughout your early 20s, each with the intention of a long-term monogamous relationship. And this means you should immediately discard the absolute caricature in the side negative case that you never realize you like coming, or like you never talk to anyone who's different from your high school sweetheart. They never engage with the actual trade-off here, which is 3 loving, caring relationships where you're trying your best to support the other person, or 17 trivial ones that are meaningless that you're just doing to get a quick route on holidays, and that is fatal for them. 2 things in this speech, firstly on stakes, then on quality. Firstly, on stakes, I want to start by asking if it is good for there to be stakes in a relationship. Because Neg, I think, tries to flip our argument that long-term relationships are more serious and important than short-term ones by saying that this importance deters people from entering into these relationships and scares them off. Charlie already symmetricizes this by explaining that there are a series of exogenous reasons why people enter relationships, which I think means they cannot get the harm. But I want to additionally flip it by just explaining that I think it's extremely unclear that the sets of people they identify should enter a relationship. Like, they point to people who are traumatized from the end of a really important relationship to them, or people who feel unprepared to be in a real relationship. And I do not think those people are likely to be well served by entering into short-term romantic relationships. That is because those are the set of people who are most emotionally vulnerable by their concession, who are most likely to catch feelings for someone who does not love them back, who are most likely to be able to be exploited by someone who just wants to have sex with them. It is so unclear that those people should waste their 20s trying to recover futilely from a bad relationship by having short-term, unfulfilling relationships instead of just going to therapy or making some friends or some other better way to recover from that trauma. So that flips the argument. I think it is clear broadly that short-term relationships, the low stakes-ness of them is not a benefit. Let's though talk about the benefits that we identify of having high stakes, or I guess important non-trivial relationships, and weigh those. Firstly, on commitment, this I think is basically conceded, because the central like concept, I think, of the negative case is essentially like the secretary problem, right? You need to try people out to like realize what your preferences are. I think the problem with this is a deeply cynical and miserable way of viewing relationships. That is, you should not view other people as like trying to find the best candidate for your life. You should like shape the person who you are in a relationship around you. Like, you should share interests. You should be willing to make compromises. You should like, oh, come on. Like, I just think it is important to be willing to make these kind of compromises rather than, I don't want to be like, it's like neoliberally searching out the best person, like you're a fucking hiring manager. That's not what a relationship is. Come on. What we tell you is that the counterfactual skill you learn when you're seriously invested in a relationship is the skill of commitment. It's a skill of being able to make compromises. It's a skill of caring about someone even when they're imperfect, even when they don't look that good, or even when they're kind of annoying or whatever it might be. That is an important skill to learn. And the reason why we tell you it's so important is because you need it later in life. You need to get it ASAP. The second thing, though, we explain is that we uniquely give people the ability to deal with criticism and conflict. I don't think, ever respond successfully to this. I don't know why you would not just leave a short-term casual fling, a situationship, when the going got tough. And the problem with that is it creates an idealized perception of relationship in these people's minds, which means in the future, when they're in a serious relationship, they're always looking back to when it was easy, when it felt simple. But of course, the difference there is there were no stakes, and that is not a meaningful comparative, but it does prevent them from seriously entering into a relationship. All of that goes to say that stakes are the lifeblood of a relationship. They are the things that make people care, the things that make people able to commit. I think that is incredibly important. It is not good simply to easily enter into a relationship if that relationship is not meaningful, if it does not teach you anything useful. I'll take a point of information now.
In your best case, you don't learn these skills until you turn 25. But at the point where you're 25, you're more emotionally mature. So it's far easier for you to pick up these skills and to adjust your expectations. Surely it is fine to be
so you're just status quo bias. Like, the reason why a lot of people are more mature and better at relationships by the time they're 25 is that they've been in one or two long-term relationships that they cared about and they learned some skills. I think the sets of 25-year-olds who have been in like 10 short-term situationships are kind of fucked up and not mature in the way you describe. You just assume they are. That's circular and unproven. All right, let's talk about whether the quality of these relationships are good. And I want to note at the outset of this is that this also rebuts all of their like niche shit about fly in, fly out workers. That's obviously contingent on these being useful relationships. Maybe they should just masturbate, like, if these relationships are bad. You need to prove they're better than that, right? But also the other thing is, if these relationships are mostly bad and they're getting some like poor partner to like have sex with the fly in, fly out worker, you have to weigh the harm to that person over the benefit to the fly in, fly out worker. So if we prove these relationships are mostly bad, clearly that stuff is out. All right, I want to start with sex. Their claim on sex is to be like, firstly, they rebut our rape thing by saying you might struggle to say no to your partner. I want to respond to that. I think this is obviously untrue. Like, obviously, you're more likely to show your long-term romantic partner grace and be understanding of them, which I think means that people are broadly far more comfortable with that, as opposed to what they describe as a relationship which is hinged on the validation of looking pretty, of getting an ego hit, of going on fun dates that are exciting. I think you struggle to say no far more when you feel like your worth is contingent on those things, but also your partner just cares far more about you, is more likely to do things like ask questions and check that you're okay. Like, ask yourself why rape happens. It's broadly not like, it's broadly because people are uncaring towards their partner. They are willing to exploit them, to take them for granted. I think that is far more likely to occur when there is not an emotional connection. But secondly, on orgasming, I just want to note that we flip this. We explain that people are far more likely to be communicative and seriously invested in their partner at the point where they're seriously dating. Their response is just to be like, oh, you have the incentive on either side. But the problem, I think, is that good sex is not always easy. It sounds like that's true for Matt. And that, I think, it means that you need investment to be able to get through that. Like, sometimes you have to have awkward conversations. You only do that on our side when you know that that person will stick by you, whatever happens. Finally, let's talk about the quality of these relationships emotionally. We provide a series of reasons to explain that long-term relationships are likely to be good, and you get in them more on our side. We tell you that they are fulfilling, they are deeper, they provide you with more meaningful support, that they are economically useful, and that there's an opportunity cost where you sacrifice years that you could have spent with someone who you deeply care about and who you want to have kids with. Their only response to this material is to be like, well, not everyone wants a long-term relationship. Unfortunately, that's insufficient because this debate is about a norm, and they concede that most people still want a long-term relationship eventually, which means if they undercut that, they are hurting the majority of people in our society. We explain that you do not learn to have a good long-term relationship because you focus on validation, you focus on having a fun dopamine hit rather than learning commitment, because you don't get in the habit of selecting good relationships, and because you're less likely to get input from people like family and friends because they are unserious relationships. The only way that they respond to the bulk of this material is just just to say, well, you just do this later in life. But what we explain is you must do this early because this takes time to learn. It's not good enough to start when you're 25 because you might have a couple of failed long-term relationships and then you only get married when you're 35. And that was something which was deeply frustrating for people. It meant that they missed out on things that they cared very deeply about still. Things like having kids, things like having support in the rough times, things like being able to buy a house. That was hugely regrettable. So proud to go in.
Thanks, Golfweb. Inviting Outweb whenever you're ready.
Charlie's at 2. So I guess Oscar is doing the reply.
Champion, you are unmuted.
Beth.
Oh shit, sorry.
Okay. All right, let's briefly deal with the sexual assault material. 3 responses. First, intimate partner violence is actually likely to be more common the higher the stakes are, because the higher the stakes are, the less of an ability that your partner has to reprise against you, and the more insulated you feel from consequences for what you do, and therefore you're more likely to. Second, in the absence of casual romance, casual sex can still exist, and you probably seek out the casual sex outside of the context of casual romance, for instance, by going to a bar, which means that all of the harms identified by this affirmative team plus up. Thirdly, the rise and acceptance of casual relationships in popular culture means that there are more discussions about how to handle those casual relationships. So there's likely to be more discussion about consent because people incorrectly, but do believe that consent is more of an issue in casual relationships than in long-term relationships because they perceive that long-term relationships are healthy and people care about each other. So the fact that people have normalized casual relationships also means that they've normalized the importance of caring about consent and has led to a substantial rise in discussions and people understanding, one, that consent is important, and secondly, how to talk about what you want. Okay, I'm now going to win this debate first in the easy way by pointing out we get way more relationships, and then in the hard way by pointing out that these relationships are better than the counterfactual. What we explain is that there's a set of people who can't get into a relationship or cannot get into a long-term relationship. For instance, we use the example of FIFO workers as our second of 4 mechanisms, and then they just rebut FIFO workers over and over and over again. Because I'm like, well, there's a lot of people like FIFO workers. And the response is, well, no, most people stay in the same place. Yes, but geography wasn't the only constraining mech. There's also people without enough time to commit to a serious relationship, people without enough willingness to commit to a serious relationship, people who haven't found someone they're willing to. So yes, each example or each particular logistical problem that someone has in their life might be niche, but the set of people who have a logistical problem is incredibly large, and that means that there's a substantial set of people who can't get involved. They then say, well, there's substantial pressure to get into a relationship anyway, so you are likely to get into a relationship. First, even if there's pressure, that can't overcome the simple logistical reality. Secondly, even if it's true that in the past most people did, the world is different now. Capitalism has atomized people more than ever before. People are busier. And thirdly, if they're talking about the counterfactual being, well, a set of people who do not logistically want to or are able to get into a relationship but are forced to, that is probably a set of incredibly bad relationships that we're happy to trade off, right? Like people who do not want to and can't but are nonetheless forced to probably end up in the relationships that make them the least happy. So if that's the counterfactual, we also take an incredibly large win on the negative team. Their final claim as well, just have a long-term relationship that is temporarily long distance. First, many people don't want to have a partner that is temporarily long distance over and over again. But secondly, this has the example problem again, because a temporary long distance relationship gets around one class of logistical problem, which is FIFO workers, but not around all possible reasons why a person might be logistically unable to get into a relationship. You don't have to believe here specifically that the FIFO workers are the thing. We just explain a class of reasons and a set of people who do not have the capacity to enter long-term relationships. And I'm sure many of you know them. Many of you will know people who say, I'm not interested, I'm not able to get into a relationship right now. Yeah, Sydney LGB, go on.
Yeah, these constraints are very limited. They apply for short periods of people's lives and to a small amount of people. You need to explain that these short-term relationships are sufficiently good for that set of people that it's worth smashing people's expectations of their lives on net.
Yeah, so they don't apply for a small amount of people. They apply for almost everyone. Almost everyone will have situations in life that are logistically constrained. You're correct about the first thing you say, though, which is they apply for a short period of time, typically earlier in people's lives when they're less wealthy and have less agency, which suggests that that is the set of time when they get into the long-term relationships, which actually rebuts your impact. Your first mechanism rebuts your impact, because the fact that it is temporally constrained also means it probably doesn't mean you don't get into longer-term relationships. Let's then start on, so we clearly went on just more people get in relationships, which are good. So now we're in the harder way, which is why are these relationships actually better? Their central push is stakes are required for a relationship to be meaningful. Firstly, I would say that you can have very meaningful relationships without commitment. I would say that you can have intimacy with someone. Someone can be important to you, even without committing to them in the long term. It is not true that commitment, saying I'm going to follow through, is required for meaningful relationships. Think about the number of people who have holiday romances and say that changed their lives. It was deeply meaningful to them, even though there was no commitment. But secondly, I would flip this. I would say that in many cases, stakes are constraining to the value of the relationship, because stakes say you can't afford to give this up. Stakes say you have to be risk averse in what you do, or you might end it. I would say that stakes often make relationships less meaningful because people are scared. They're less able to actualize their agency. So their central push about stakes being important is not true. Secondly, in terms of long-term relationships, we explain that this teaches you things about relationships into the long term. They say, but the problem is it's low stakes. But that's how you learn, right? That's why we don't teach people in the high stakes situation. We have them learn in a low stakes classroom, and then they go into the high stakes situation, because you learn better when the stakes are lower, because you feel more comfortable to be able to try things. You feel like you don't have to constrain yourself. So actually the stakes being lower and then gradually ramping up is the best way for people to learn, rather than throwing them in the deep end. And they say, well, there's an opportunity cost to learning in serious relationships. First, we point out often the comparative isn't serious relationships. But secondly, even if it is serious relationships, often that doesn't create learning, that creates trauma. Where it's too serious and you're not emotionally mature enough to deal with that seriousness, it doesn't teach you things. It creates trauma for the rest of your life that you're often never able to recover from. Why do they say that these relationships are likely to be bad? First thing they say is, well, you shouldn't enter relationships if you are a vulnerable person that we identify. But we think that you should. Those vulnerable people should be able to dip their toe back in the water to have love and companionship, but in a way that is low stakes and safe and isn't likely to re-traumatize them. We don't think that traumatized people should deny themselves of love and companionship. They say this is likely to delay your substantive relationships in your life, and that means you're going to have children later, which perhaps has some medical drawbacks. But I would say that women delaying childbirth has on net been a benefit. Like, yes, maybe there's some medical drawbacks that we've been able to mitigate with medical technology, but it's also brought women an enormous amount of economic agency and actually on net been a benefit. Their big claim then is well, people fall in love and that is likely to be a harm. People are likely to be hurt by that. But yeah, they might be hurt. But being hurt by a relationship isn't the end of the world if the stakes weren't there. Being hurt by a relationship, getting in a bit too deep, is a normal part of this. They then attempt to symmetricize everything we say by saying, well, you get all of the benefits with 3 relationships. First, we get far more than 3, so it's a far more bigger diversity. But secondly, our benefits are actually about the lack of commitment. The fact that you have less pressure, the fact that you can play more and actualize your agency more, mean that even if it was 3 on both sides, 3 low commitment relationships would often provide you with a better, more utile experience on net.
I think we're inviting all reply whenever you're ready.
Hello, hope I can be heard.
Yep, audible.
Perfect, thank you.
No, Jackie, the microphone broke. Just be your speech up.
They can hear you.
Oh,
We just
sorry.
clarified that they can hear you. If we must defend the most uncharitable iteration of this debate that this affirmative team wants to push onto us, 17 meaningless relationships to 3 perfect ones, then that is a trade-off we are willing to take under our side of the house. Because what this team never responds to is the very simple idea we explained to you down the bench, that 17 shallow relationships is 17 lessons learned, 17 red flags, 17 firm barriers you've been able to identify in yourself and say that you would not accept them in a long-term relationship. And that is exposure we get only under our side of the house, when we grant individuals the self-knowledge to meaningfully express their desires, to advocate for their own interests when they do enter a relationship that they believe to be worthwhile. Two issues in this reply speech. Firstly, let's talk about quality of life. This team meaningfully only has two main complaints about the ways in which these short-term relationships are likely to be engaged in. The first is this idea that these relationships are fundamentally shallow. But as Kat points out to no response, this is deeply unlikely to be the case. Even individuals at the base level of romance still express an active desire to get to know one another, to come to understand each other. We think that you are able to access most of the benefits we explain around empathy and sexual interaction because you engage in the practice of those behaviors just in a low stakes context. The second claim we hear is this idea that, well, maybe these relationships will hurt because individuals acquire mismatched expectations. But the problem with this team is they never consider what the effect of those mismatched expectations is on their own system. And I explain in my speech that at the point at which mismatched expectations occur in a short-term relationship, people can leave much more easily because there is an expectation that is acceptable. But under their side of the house, they constrain a partner who is not willing to move forward with that relationship, who does not want to continue to engage, to stay in that relationship for the long term this team requires to defend their benefits. Clearly a far worse harm under their side of the house to very little response. At the end of this then, I think it's clear that these relationships are ultimately quite good for the vast majority of individuals who entered into them, especially when Kat provides you the context that the set of individuals selecting into them are probably young people who don't have experience and aren't ready for the long-term relationships that team wants to eke out as their ultimate good. Let's look at the second issue in this reply speech then, which is just about if stakes are good or not. And I think we provide you with a true flood of material to suggest why those stakes are actually quite deleterious. Firstly, we explained to you that the existence of stakes means that you're far less likely to join relationships at all because they apply a substantial amount of pressure, because they mean that you violate your own logistical requirements. And note that that set of individuals is particularly large per Matt's analysis, but even if they were not, I would dare you to look into the eyes of a FIFO worker and say that their relationship does not matter. We are, of course, all human. We should all be entitled to love. But secondly, we explained to you that the existence of the stakes in and of itself harms enjoyment. And the key thing to observe, as Matt whips at third negative, is that that harm applies at the start of the relationship, when things are at the most nascent, when you are the least ready to engage in that long-term commitment. And that is what makes further progression far less likely under their side of the house, because it's only under our side of the house that we alleviate that pressure, make it so people can enter that relationship with joy and playfulness and truly be willing to explore with one another. This team says that it's an important life skill to learn how to get together and become willing to compromise. Kat already rebuts this by explaining it's probably fine if you're a bit more mature before you internalize the sorts of key life lessons this team wants you to believe are so critical. And the only impact they give you is this idea that people will be married at the age of 35. Oh no, I'll tell my parents that they should get divorced, I guess. Like, that's fine. They don't explain why that's a bad thing. But secondly, the alternative this team proposes for young people is either, let's go down the list, nothing, hookups, or an immediate long-term relationship. So when they ask you the question, why would you not keep it casual? I think they answer the premise of this debate. Why would you not if you're the set of individuals who are going to enter into them?
I think I'll reply, inviting the reply to close the debate whenever you're ready.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep, audible.
Right. The question I want to ask at the outset of this reply is a casual relationship a good or a bad experience for people? Because the thing is, the rise of casual romance hasn't really supplanted the cultural primacy of long-term relationships. It's just kicked the can down the road, later in life, instead of something that's being practiced and learned younger in life. And what that means is that even when the rise of casual romance has changed the way people enter relationships, most people aspire to and do end up in long-term relationships for most of their life. And we should prioritize the quality and trajectory of these. But also, it suggests that regardless, the value that people culturally place on long-term relationships is high, because the financial and emotional benefits of being truly seen by another person is enormous. So if we were able to win benefits to this group of relationships, which are the largest, which are the most emotionally and financially significant, making them more successful for more people and more successful in cases where they exist, then we will win the debate. And I do think we explain that casual relationships are deleterious for that group. Because spending more time in your 20s engaging in casual relationships rather than seriously attempting into long-term monogamous relationships hurts your ability to enter successful and stable long-term relationships for two reasons. First, because there's an opportunity cost of the skills that you need to practice. They spend more time practicing giving someone a good blowjob. We spend more time practicing staying when it's hard and learning to love a person when it's hard. But it also, casual relationships inculcate a set of skills, as we explained, that are deleterious to the skills that are needed to preserve and make a long-term relationship successful. They teach you that relationships have an easy out, just leaving, which makes it harder to keep persisting when relationships, as we explained, are effortful and hard. They make it harder to get exposure, harder to be vulnerable because other people are more close off to you, which means you are shut off for much more of your life. And it seems much harder to be good in a long-term relationships. And it teaches you to see others far more often for their sexual experiences and for their sexual skills more than what they're able to give to you emotionally, what you're able to give to them emotionally. Their response is twofold, or threefold rather. First is to say some situationships can be emotionally intimate. Obviously, that's a minority of cases, but it doesn't really rebut the idea that an ease of exit means that people have deleterious skills that they've learned, so I don't think that gets them very far. The second is to say that stakes make you risk averse, but I would just say that's a good thing. Like, conflict happens in relationships. Emotions are big. To get the benefit of a relationship, you need to be enticed to salvage it when it's hard, to work through it instead of throwing it away, which is exactly what a casual relationship tells you isn't worth doing, which is bad. It makes you more likely to cheat. It makes you more likely to throw those relationships away. And then there's Kat's assertion, which is that, well, they delay it till when people are older and more mature, so that's good. But why does being older make you better at those skills? They just don't explain it. I think that's a status quo bias where they're describing people who have actually entered into relationships 3 or 4 and are therefore more experienced. That isn't true of people who are in 15, 17 casual relationships in their 20s when they try to enter long-term relationships in their 30s. I don't think they've refuted us. So our relationships are good and they're better. They also, I just want to note, don't really rebut the childbirth harms. They say, well, it's given women agency. Well, when they're later in their career, they have to take time off where there's more money to be lost. I don't know. Brief note on their FIFO argument, which I think is weighed out by all that. But 3 negative tries to resuscitate this into, well, also some people have time constraints, but that problem becomes more serious in your 30s when you have a more serious job, where you most want a long-term relationships. But this teaches people at that critical period of their life that they're unpracticed and it makes them callous, and they're far more likely in that case to be alone and jaded. This team does not change that people eventually want the benefits of long-term monogamous relationships, to feel emotionally loved, and to have economic security. What they do is take a cultural sledgehammer to the normative practices that allow people to get through the hardships and access the benefits. This is a clear AF win.